So we are going to ask that you stay muted for the presentation. And then if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I will ask them as we go through or at the very end. And if we don't get to all of the questions, we will make sure to send out an email with the answers afterwards so you have all the information that you need. But without further ado, I am going to welcome Dan Brown. He is the founder and president of Partners, which is a nationally and globally capable consulting firm that specializes in providing safety services for their clients. And today he's really going to talk about what it takes to be open for business for us here in the Valley. So Dan, thank you so much for joining us. And he is a local here, so you'll probably see him around as we start opening things up. But we wanted to thank you so much for being able to do this with us today.
Well, thanks very much, Lauren. I look forward to it, and welcome to everybody that joined. We're going to get right to things, and my hope is to talk about some of the processes that maybe aren't so clear, that are in between the lines in terms of how to get these businesses back opened up. It's not as easy as it looks, I think, as any business owner would say, and there's a bunch of steps that are involved, and it's not a walk in the park. But it is possible. And I think you're going to hear me say this a couple times today, but this is really all about how we stay opened up. Really, that's probably my biggest and most important message to everybody. It's easy to open the door back up, and how we stay open is really critical. So I'm going to talk about these things today. I'm going to remind us all about the current stay-at-home order, which technically is still in place and has aspects of it that are applicable. Of course, we know we now have a returning to work or safer from home order. I want to talk a little bit about the virus itself, just so we understand it a little bit better, clear up maybe some misconceptions. And then I want to remind people that we have a lot of other agencies that are in the conversation here. It's not just the county's return to work order. There's technically a state return to work order. There's a federal return to work order. There's guidance from the Center for Disease Control. And there's, most importantly for business owners, an OSHA standard now that applies in guidance. And eventually I'm going to get to talking about some best practices and really what I think we need to think about in terms of next steps. And I think that's really where the rubber meets the road on the conversation today. And of course, I want to encourage you to use the chat feature and offer questions along the way. And Lauren will be screening those, and let me know if there's something that comes up that we want to address. And then I'm going to be providing a lot of information along the way with links. Don't feel like you got to scratch all those down on paper real quick. This is all going to be posted to the Vail Valley Partnership website eventually, and you'll be able to go there and pick these up. But a reminder to everybody, we have a current stay-at-home order in place in Colorado. And it's important because it still spells out things like what's an essential business and other businesses and things that can be open and how we can travel and things of that type. And so this hasn't gone away, and it's worth knowing about. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. We can all go back and read it. And a lot of it is outdated relative to the current county order here in Eagle, and as well as the Colorado Safer from Home. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this now, but you should know it's still out there. It's still applicable, and it's something you should have read. If you haven't already, then read it now. It is still important. So why is all this important? I think just a couple notes about the virus itself. We all, can read Facebook and we can see all these crazy things that are being said. And of course, we have people at both ends of the spectrum like we always do. But here's the no BS story, right? Here's what's really going on. It is a highly transmittable virus. That's its problem. It transmits very, very easily. And that's problem number one. And the way it happens is through these water droplets. And they're not water droplets like the drop of water coming out of your faucet. They're very small, blowing through the air, primarily when you sneeze or cough or expel some kind of water from you. And it gets in the air, and if someone's close enough to you, it gets to them. And so that's why this whole thing about distancing and preventing this water droplet and getting it into your body is the key. And how does it do it? It primarily does it through your mouth, nose, and eyes. People may not think of their eyes, but those are ways that germs and other things can enter your body. And so one other thing to note about these water droplets, which is a little bit of a newer thing, is people have talked a lot about, well, you know, don't I have to be worried that I'm going to walk into this store and someone sneezed 20 minutes ago and the water droplets are still floating around and I'm going to get sick that way? Well, there's also kind of a dose side to this to think about, without getting too technical and too scientific, which is the water droplets we're really talking about that transmit the disease are fairly large and fairly heavy. And I mean this in a very relative sense, right? They're not heavy compared to my weight, but they're just relative to water floating in the air. And those are the ones that within 6 feet fall to the ground or fall and don't, you know, and disappear and dissipate and are no longer really a concern. There could be much smaller droplets that stay in the air, maybe that you're concerned about, but those are so small and so light, they tend to not land on anything or go in anything. They tend to just be caught up in air patterns. And so there isn't really this high risk that somehow you're going to walk into some place where someone once sneezed and you're going to get sick. That's really not a viable, logical, common scenario. It's those larger droplets that someone sneezes and you're 2 feet away from them and you know, you breathe it in. There is a lot of data about how long these things can live on surfaces. And of course, most people would say that 2 days is about it. 3 maybe is, you know, is the longest anyone could really imagine. Again, some of this information is changing, but for the most part, you don't really expect this virus to live on surfaces more than a day or 2. And again, there's so far, no significant indication that this ever transmits through sewage, potable drinking water, food. So not a lot of risk there. So when people talked about this thing called, you know, flattening the curve, why was that important? And why was that term used so much? And it was all about this exponential nature of the transmission. So here's the graphs from Colorado that you could see starting, you know, prior to about March 8th, there's no cases, right? None whatsoever, 0. And then within just a few days, 10 days or so, you're in hundreds of cases and then thousands of cases, right? So the issue is that it escalates extremely quickly, and that escalation can overwhelm the healthcare system. And it's when the healthcare system is overwhelmed that people die. The mortality rate, not to be too, you know, morbid here, the mortality rate for this disease is extremely low when, this is a key when, there's healthcare services, right? So our whole thing here is you have this very transmittable thing that escalates very quickly because it transmits easily amongst people and turns into a problem very, very fast. And then you have problems with not being able to get the healthcare. And when you can't get the healthcare, that's when people are dying. So why are these masks and social distancing important? Well, I think you can kind of see it minimizes the transmission. And there's a critical component to that, which is that many, many people are asymptomatic. So what does that mean? That means that they can be sick and carrying the disease and sneeze and transmit it to you, even though they never showed any symptoms or signs. So they didn't know to stay home or self-quarantine or, you know, go to a hospital or do anything. And so they're just out, happy-go-lucky, you know, living their life, and they pass the disease to you unknowingly. That's a very common occurrence and very easy to do. And so the social distancing and the masks are all about preventing not only known transmission, but the unknown transmission, which is the thing that just escalates the curve, causes the hospitals to be overwhelmed, then we don't have healthcare and people die. That's the chain of events we're trying to avoid, right? That's what all this is about. So knowing that we've created capacity back in the healthcare system, the state of Colorado came out and said, hey, we can start opening up. And they've laid out a process for how they want to do that. The order that was in place through April 26th is expiring, and this new order is now the one that's good. And it talks about what needs to be done here in terms of how retailers can open and if they can use, you know, what procedures they can use. All of this is interesting, but frankly, it's trumped by the Eagle County order. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this other than to recognize that in other places in Colorado, this is the thing that you have to follow. So if you have businesses here and in other places, you may have rules here in Eagle County you have to follow. You may have rules in other places in Colorado. And of course, there's still a lot of control out there, right? And one of the things you're going to hear me say later is just because these orders are now in place doesn't mean anyone can open, because you have to be able to do certain things to open at all. Okay. And I can see I got some sort of typo came through with this as we maybe in the electronic copying there's a little glitch there. We'll get that fixed. But let's talk about the Eagle County. So the Eagle County orders, which hopefully everyone's seen. If you haven't, there's a link and you can jump on there and look at it. And it's a very thoughtful, and from my opinion, a very well thought out and protective and reasonable process. And I'm a very big supporter of what they're suggesting. It seems to make a lot of sense to me. And again, the concept here is that with some incremental lifting of restrictions and a demonstration that that doesn't cause this escalation of adverse effects and then a overwhelming of the healthcare system, that we can live with this virus in our community going forward, right? So that responsibility is not just on employers, it's on everybody. It's going to take all of us following these procedures to ensure that we don't get that spike, because if we see the spike again, we all know what's going to happen. We're going to lock down the community again, and the businesses are going to close, and we're going to shut down, and then we're going to have even more stringent steps to come back online. And so this process of coming back online is one that is all about how do we continue to stay open. And why is that? Because the virus hasn't gone away, right? Everyone gets that. Everyone understands that. And if you don't listen to it very clearly, the virus has not gone away. The virus is just as out there as it was on March 8th, before we even had one illness in the Valley. It's no less prevalent. It's no less dangerous. It's no less capable of making you very sick and or killing you. Like, it's all those things none of those things have changed. What's changed is we're not acting naively or blindly about how to manage it. We're implementing systems that should allow us to manage it, just like we have systems like a seatbelt in your car that helps protect you, right? Doesn't mean you're not going to get killed driving or injured. That could happen, but your risk is extremely low with an airbag, a seatbelt, proper adherence to the laws, right? Same process here, right? So some key components of the order. It retains this definition of essential business, so it's important to go back and reflect on that. That comes from that first order. But now what it says is other businesses, meaning the rest of us, can now start to open back up. There are still some carve-outs that are, absolute no's, like school, right, isn't opening up anytime soon. But for the most part, almost across the board, almost all of the businesses are able to be open. It also has a key important definition of local residents, which does include the second homeowners. Now, that hadn't been the case before, but if you own a home up here, it's acceptable to be here and to be in the area. That wasn't the case recently. And I think that's primarily because the risks there are fairly low, but also I think to help spur the economic, condition up here. There's still needs for isolation of people that are sick. So you're going to find that, and I think everyone needs to be prepared for this. Our understanding of civil liberties is going to change. We are going to be asked questions, and the government is going to be able to do things like look at your phone and see where you went and what you did if in fact you become sick. As a means of trying to figure out who might else be sick, so that we can shut that corridor of transmission down, right? So again, that's the key here. People are going to continue to get sick. When that happens, we don't want to act like we did before, which is nobody cares. Everyone just keeps walking around, talking to each other, hugging each other, handshaking, whatever, and it just spreads exponentially. What we want to do is say, hey, we found this thing. This person at work got sick. Okay, who else was at work that day? Who did they talk to in their personal life? Who was in their house with their family? Quarantine all those people and at least stop the process so that we don't overwhelm the system again, right? So that we isolate one strain of contact instead of all of us, right? And again, these gatherings, very important. They're still going to be minimized. Social distancing is required. And we will only have local residents up here still, right? So there's no through traffic still to this point. Other things to really focus on, I talked a little bit about the travel restrictions. So we're talking about local residents only. There are some lodging things that are opening up. I mean, for the most part, lodging isn't available because we're saying no one can come up here. All right, so the county is still, for the most part, locked down to residents or people that own a home in this county or are in a neighboring county and work here. However, there is a concept here that, like, you know, you're getting ready to go over Vail Pass and storms blow in and everything's shut down and these people need somewhere to stay. That kind of short-term lodging is possible. And of course, you could have a bed and breakfast in the county servicing other people in the county. That would be acceptable too, things of that type. The recreational uses are open, but the high-touch things are staying closed. So, you know, those are examples like, you know, the playgrounds and things of that type. And then, you know, there are some limitations on businesses that have to stay closed. We're not quite ready for dine-in restaurants and bars to be open in the same way. And there's a strong recommendation that high-risk populations remain in lockdown, you know, that you continue to limit your traveling, your outside excursions, anything, because high-risk populations are still very vulnerable to this disease. And until there's a vaccine or more known about this, that's just not going to change. Okay. So if you are a business and you can open, how the heck do you do that, right? It's Eagle County has produced a social distancing protocol. You can get this document, which is sort of a fill-in-the-blank guidance for you. What I would call is a minimum standard. So if you're trying to open up, if you want to get operating again, this is not sort of the gold standard. I think this is the minimum standard for you to be compliant in our county. It doesn't mean that that is exactly going to work for you in your situation, in your business. And what I will tell you, you know, as a business owner, you know, we operate 5 different states. We have multiple offices. I think our largest maybe has 20 or 25 people in it. It's taking us a couple weeks to just figure out how to let our own staff back into our offices, right? And there are aspects of it that we're not ready to allow, even though it may be, like, for example, in Ohio, we're allowed to come back to work. Well, we're not prepared. Why? Because you have to do all these things now. You can't just open and hope you're going to do it right. This is an order that establishes exact and specific protocols that you must follow. And while those are sort of generalized protocols, there may be some very specific things that relate to your individual business that are difficult to comply with and that are required for you to be able to open that you may or may not be able to do at this moment in time, right? So a couple key things, of course, it's got to be posted. So this protocol has to be out there in front that anyone can see and read and review. And I would even encourage you to go farther than that. I would tell you to make it very public, right? There's self-screening requirements for your employees, of course, social distancing and mask requirements. And here's a really tough one. You got to have hand sanitizer or soap and water or disinfectants of some kind available for your employees, and in the case of retail establishments, for any guests or visitors to your facility. So I'm telling you right now, if you can't go down to Costco and pick up hand sanitizer, guess what? You can't open. That's not a maybe. That's, you cannot open. This is an order, right? So there are things, if you don't have a contactless payment methodology, you can't open, right? So some of these rules and requirements, while sounding fairly straightforward and fairly generic, when you get down to how you're going to implement them in your facility, it could be a little more complicated for you, and you're really going to have to put some thought into it. Not that you can't work through it, but there are some things that really have to be thought through so that you can be prepared. And then they, of course, made it Colorado. Like, I love Colorado, right? So Colorado, of course, has to make it into a ski map, right? Right? Like, I love this. This is like maybe my favorite thing about the whole program. So, of course, you know, we all understand this, you know, green, blue, black diamond. We are green. We are at the beginner slope. And what that means is that as we implement this first column of requirements, we have to successfully do that. What is success measured by? Capacity remaining in the healthcare system. We have to implement this successfully before we can take any more steps, before we can get to the intermediate runs, before we can advance the ball for our businesses. There isn't any, we're just going to miraculously get to the next step. We got to do green correctly. We all have to see the outcome of green working or adjust for it as needed. And then and only then, once that's proven for weeks or months, we may be able to take the next step to the next level, right? So this gives you a really easy, quick guide for what applies to what, who applies to who. But for the most part, what you're talking about is if you can maintain social distancing, if you can provide disinfectant, proper disinfectant, and you can put a plan in place. For the most part, you can open. There's obviously some significant carve-outs for in healthcare facilities, at schools, lodging facilities, dine-in restaurant. There are still some very large carve-outs, but there is the ability for, by and large, most businesses, retail or otherwise, to get themselves back into some form of operation. And I think this is an important takeaway. This is an unfortunate thing, and I'm not saying it lightly, but some businesses may not be able to operate in a way that's profitable and still comply with these rules. I mean, there's a new normal about what is acceptable, and some businesses might not be able to meet the requirement and yet still open in a way that is worth opening, is able to make money. And that's going to be a tough bridge for people to cross here as time goes on. So that's the Colorado rules. I'm going to talk about some best practices, some real life things in a second, but I want to also mention there's a federal guidance, right? The Opening America again. And this again is somewhat similar. There's various what they call gating criteria, which before anything can happen, certain things have to be in place, cases have to be down, hospitals have to have capacity. If you have any symptoms, you can't go out in public, right? And then you have to have some, states have to have the ability to demonstrate a couple things like testing and capacity and plans in place. Colorado's clearly done that. So that's why things are starting here. And then it's definitely phased, just like, we're doing here. Many of these programs have a lot of similarities. And again, I don't think there's a point of looking deeply at this. The way that government, by and large works here in the US is, it's home rule, meaning that the local regulations trump the county, trump the federal, as long as they meet those standards and are more detailed or more specific. So the county standards meet the minimum of the federal. They are more detailed. They are acceptable, and they are the driving factors here. And these other ones really won't be applicable for us, other than the state maybe cares about them because that's how they're going to open, right? But you should be aware if you're working in other states or in other places outside of just Colorado, then these are important to you, and I've given you the link for it. Should also be aware, this is really my go-to, the Center for Disease Control. I think that they do the best job, unbiased, non-political, fact-based information. And what you'll find there is it focuses on all the same things we're talking about. But I will tell you that they have one really critical component that I think is just an incredible takeaway here, because I think we all get caught up in our own little worlds and concerns and priorities. And what the CDC talks about is my last bullet there, is that more than anything, our responsibility is to make sure that critical workers could get to their job. And I get that as a business owner, I want to be open, right? And I want to be profitable, and I don't want to go out of business. I get that. But if I can't get drinking water to my house, or sewage, or electricity, or fuel, or food, then I got news for you. None of this other stuff matters. I promise you, your business can stay closed a lot longer than you can survive without water, okay? And so if what happens is we don't follow through in our process, you remember what I talked about, our responsibility, and we end up getting the workers that have to man the sewer plants and the water treatment plants and the food service places and the other critical aspects of our lives, we are going to be up, you know which creek without a paddle. And so they, more than anybody, are the ones that have to be protected. And our responsibility as we go out into the world and we open up our businesses is to make sure, beyond our own needs, that those people are protected. And I think the CDC gets that right when they tell you that. So as business owners, this is probably, you know, maybe arguably the most important takeaway. These, the virus itself and the impact that may occur to employees of yours as business owners are now subject to the OSHA regulations. So that means you, as a business owner, now have a whole new set of OSHA regulations that apply to you. There's not only guidance out there, but it's now considered a reportable injury if one of your employees gets the virus at work. Now that could be from a guest, that could be from another employee, but when they get sick at work now, that's an OSHA reportable, and obviously has adverse implications on not only your insurance, but your ability to, you know, staff your facility, and potentially has liability for your business, not any different than any other way an employee might get hurt while at your workspace. So you as an employer now have an obligation that you didn't have before under OSHA to protect your employees relative to this pandemic virus, very specific. And here's, I think, you know, a very important takeaway from this conversation, which is, as all these health departments have opened up their hotlines, who do you think is calling the hotlines? The people that are calling the hotlines overwhelmingly are disgruntled employees. So overwhelmingly, the calls that are coming in are people that are having to go to work and not happy about the working conditions and fear of getting the virus. And they're reporting to the health departments that their employers aren't taking the right steps and don't have the right things in to protect them so that they can go to work and do their job. You would maybe think as an employer, I'm putting my owner hat on, that people would be thrilled to have their jobs back and be coming back to work. You will be surprised if you don't follow these procedures, how quickly that will not be the case, and how quickly you'll be answering, to the health department knocking on your door, asking for all these things that are required. And so it's something that you have to be cognizant of and not take lightly, because it's opened up a whole new sort of round of issues for business owners. It was tough enough, right? But here's another layer that you have to be aware of. So let me turn away from the regulations and a little bit about best practices, and we'll sort of kind of head to the home stretch here on the presentation. So importantly, it's not over, right? I think best case, a vaccine in 2021 would be my guess, which means the virus is going to be here. It's not going anywhere. It's going to be in our communities. It's going to rebound. And I think even more importantly, now that we've crossed this bridge, right, of a worldwide pandemic, I think what we have to recognize as business owners is what this is all about is, how do we never get shut down again? Because there's going to not just be this virus that rebounds or comes back or does whatever it's going to do that no one knows, but there's going to be the next virus and the next pandemic. And what we want to be able to do is operate as a business and function and be profitable when the next thing hits. We don't want to get shut down again. And so part of what we have to figure out is how to be in position to operate in the future, in this future world that is now among us, right? And I think that that's an important step for business owners to think about, is not just how do I get my thing open and just get through this thing I got to get through. It's about how am I going to stay open and put the things in place so I never get shut down again, right? So I'm going to talk about some best practices. You can see them here. And I'm going to walk you through some thoughts that I have and what I'm seeing out there, you know, from around the country. So I think importantly, you have these inward facing and outward facing considerations. And certainly inward facing considerations, what I mean by that is you have to think about your own employees and their concerns for safety. And most importantly, you have to think about how am I protecting them so that I retain a healthy workforce. My God, it's hard enough to get people to work in our businesses up here. When they're sick, the list gets even shorter, right? Or when they're not comfortable coming to work. So these are very important factors that you have to consider in opening your business is how am I going to protect my workers so they feel safe? How am I going to protect them so they don't get sick, so I don't get sick? And how do I minimize this potential for litigation, claims, whistleblower, all those other things owners hate about owning businesses, right? These liabilities that come with it. All you really want to do is run your business and you're getting, you know, sued by an employee over your work practices. So very important to think about your inward facing side of the business, but also your outward facing side, right? How are you going to attract the public to your establishment? How are you going to attract people to come in and feel comfortable that it's okay to walk through the door? And how are you going to build confidence in the public that you're a safe place to come and do business and spend money? And importantly, how are you going to protect your employees so that they're not made sick by the people coming into your establishment? Because then guess what? You're back to this slide, right? I got no one that can come to work today, right? So very important to think about how you're implementing these things. And so what I'm telling you, you know, what I'm going to say to you is you need a written plan. Now in Eagle County, you need a written plan because it's an order that you need a written plan, all right? But what I'm telling you is you need a written plan because you need to go through the thought process that it takes to really figure out. And by the way, you see up there my written plan, my company's written plan. We have to have one too. That it really takes a thought process of how to engineer how you literally are going to come to work each day and comply with these things. It's really difficult to do right now. Things are changing all the time. And if you don't take the time to really write it down and get it thought through, you're going to find it's going to be chaos. It's just going to be chaos. People are going to come back to work. They're not going to know what to do. They're going to do the wrong things. They're going to ask a lot of questions. People are going to come in. You're going to get overwhelmed by something. They're not going to follow the rules. So you really have to sit down and think through. And this is very specific to your business. It has nothing to do with what the business next to you is doing. It's going to be very, very specific to your business and the layout of your facility and what it can take to be functioning profitably and how you can come to work and work comfortably. And it's going to be very, very site specific. And, you know, with that written policy, you've got to come up with these work procedures. Everyone has to do a health check before entering the facility. You've got to self-report and self-quarantine people when there's a detection or a concern over being sick. You've got to have cleaning and disinfecting capabilities. And I want to talk about this a minute. I mean, literally just before this call, we had this conversation in my own company about what is the appropriate way to disinfect our facility before we walk back in there. And boy, it's all over the map, okay? And the takeaway really here that I would offer you is don't just assume that your janitorial firm is properly qualified to disinfect your facility. They may or may not be. And you might say, well, what's the big deal? Well, you know, it is a big deal because what if they spread a bunch of chemicals, and these are harsh chemicals. What if they spread a bunch of chemicals all over your work areas that get people sick? What if they pour bleach all over your, I don't know, your beautiful rug in your entryway? What if they damage, you know, some piece of equipment because they spray some liquid spray inside some very precise electronic equipment? There's some real thought that has to be put into this disinfecting piece. And the other thing that's really, really important about that is to remember is the second that the disinfecting is done and dries or whatever, just the second it's over, its use is over. And the very next person that walks into your facility and touches a handle, start all over again, right? Start all over. So, so you want to be really thoughtful because you can throw a lot of money at this disinfecting and either get nothing for it or not really be solving any problem. And so just be cautious about that. Obviously, lots of people are going to continue to work remotely. And that's something that I think we are still at this stage of the game very much encouraging, and not pushing a lot of people into the office. And of course, masks are going to be needed in the workplace. You're not going to want to see congregating. You're not going to be using your lunchrooms and your conference rooms. You're going to want to continue to promote remote meetings. Okay. Here's a health check form that you can use as a guide for you. This one happens to be for subcontractors coming onto our facilities. But you could use this for your workers. You can just change the title at the top. But it asks you the pertinent questions. And you're going to see that these questions may be a little hard to read, but these are the questions, who have you been in contact with, and if you were exposed. So there is a required procedure to find out, who got impacted. And there's, I'm just going to say it, these days of like, I'm not feeling well, I'm just going to come to work and, keep away from people, like that ain't going to fly anymore. Those days are over. First of all, that's not allowed. Second of all, who's going to put up with that? I promise you, if you come to your office, let's say you work, I don't know, in an insurance company, you come to the office and there's somebody next to you sneezing and coughing, tell me you are not going to, throw the book at them. Right? They're going to be out of there in like 5 minutes. So I would just get over this. These days of like, worrying about what people know about your sick, those days are over. Like, this is the standard. There's going to be a health check. If you're sick, you're not coming to work. If you get sick during the day at work, you need to go home. And then it's going to be a process of reporting to the health department and tracking who you've been in contact with. That's the process. That's the way it's going to work for everybody. I want to talk a little bit here about new ways to engage the public. Really important, I think, from my perspective, and I've worked in the environmental and safety field my whole career, and I will tell you that the people that bring transparency to that process are the ones that succeed. And I would encourage you, particularly retail businesses and businesses that are bringing customers in, the more transparent you are, the more you show you know what the heck's going on, the more likely people are going to feel comfortable and safe and want to come to your facility. And that goes for your workers as well. The more they see the steps you're taking and the processes you're following, and when I walk into a restaurant and there's a control over how I stand in line, and there's a limited number of tables, and there's masks on all the workers, and there's a written policy out there, and maybe even a statement on the website and in the menu, and my server comes up to me and explains exactly the procedures they use to make sure I'm being protected, I'm going to feel a heck of a lot more comfortable in that facility than one where I walk in and there's nothing in place. And I think that's the side of the fence that's going to draw people in and give people confidence that they can come to you. And so I want to, really leave you with that thought that for business owners, whether retail or otherwise, building confidence in your process amongst your employees and your outward facing world, I think, is what's going to make the difference to allow you to step forward and function as a business again and stay open. And just think about the other side of that. You're the business that is in the paper because of the outbreak, because all your employees got sick and they got 10 other people sick that came into the store. And, that's the headline in the Vail paper next week. How likely is it that you're going to, be able to build confidence after that occurrence, right? But if you're the ones that have been taking those measures and making it very public and putting it out there front for people to see and touch and feel comfortable with, and to guide people away that aren't following the rules, I think those are the businesses that are going to stay open and remain operational through whatever happens, coming down the road. So with that, I'll wrap up. I know we wanted to have a chance, to the extent there are any questions, Lauren, if there's anything out there, I want to leave a few minutes for that. Certainly you can see our contact information there, and I'll turn it back over to you, Lauren.
Perfect. Thanks so much. That was a lot of information to take in. We will be sending the recording out afterwards in case anyone wants to rewatch, and then we'll send the presentation as well so that you can have the links to click on from Dan's presentation. But we do have a few questions, Dan. So the first was kind of specific to Eagle County and the public health order here, but you had mentioned some carve-outs. So for example, exceptions from maintaining a 6-foot distance. And we have someone in the physical therapy profession kind of wondering if that would be a carve out for them, given that they are in a contact field.
That's a good question. So I'm not aware of a, now, again, this is all changing by the minute. And I think the best way to approach this is, you know, we pull the rule out and look at it very explicitly, but I'll just sort of talk off the top of my head now. There are situations where it's impossible to have a complete separation. I experienced that myself because I had to have an MRI done recently. Well, I mean, you can't have an MRI done and not be in close contact with somebody at some level. And I was. So what was going on there? Well, there was an excessive number of protections that were also in place that were allowing for the interaction to occur, even though it couldn't retain the 6-foot social distancing. So there were masks, there was decontamination, there was cleaning of surfaces, there was minimizing contact. And so I think if you can prepare a plan that adequately considers those aspects, wearing gloves, you can rattle off some of these things. I think it is possible that a physical therapy scenario could apply. Now, having said that, do I think the traditional, 1 hour massage is the right way to be in contact right now? Probably not. Do I think it's against the rule? I'm not sure, to be honest. But there may be things that have to be reconsidered about what's acceptable and reasonable given the circumstances. Certainly, I would think there'd be a very intensive self-health check for, the healthcare workers as well as the people, getting help. But I think it is possible to create a plan, and it is possible to create a process that would allow some of these things. But I think, again, you have to really get in the weeds on an individual basis on how things are going to be handled, clean. I'll just give you my own example. I've been through physical therapy. You used to go to a facility, there's 15 or 20 other people in there. They're all touching tables and equipment and, milling around each other and walking past each other, and someone's touching you and helping you. And okay, well, I mean, that's not going to fly. It's not going to work that way. But there may be a way to do it that is able to comply. I just don't think it's going to look like it did before.
Perfect, thanks. And then we had one in regards to OSHA and those guidelines that you had talked about. So are public entities like special districts in Colorado still exempt from OSHA, or is that changed?
So that's a good point. So for those that don't understand, governments are not subject to OSHA regulations. They're for private sector employees. Now, most governments follow OSHA protocol. So I know very few governments that don't use that as sort of their guiding light. But technically, a governmental entity is not subject to OSHA. Now, having said that, the guidelines that have been established by OSHA are almost identical to those being required at the federal level, the state level, and now the county level. So to the extent you're following the procedures here in the county, which would apply, there is not I don't think there's a real risk that relates to OSHA, and there has been no change that I'm aware of that has extended the OSHA regulations to governmental entities.
Okay. Let's see, if anyone has any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I guess the other thing that we were going to mention is that Eagle County, I've sent the link to the business toolkit, and I'm happy to email out a few other links afterwards that would be helpful based on this presentation. But Eagle County does have a kind of self-reporting form that they also have a template for in terms of checking in with your employees each day that they enter the facility. And they also have some templates for those door signs like Dan had mentioned. So those are definitely going to be a good spot to kind of start with the signage piece of things for your business. But let's see, if anyone else doesn't have any questions, then we will make sure to email all of this information out to you either later today or first thing tomorrow morning, the recording as well as the presentation, so that you have those clickable links, and we'll put the business toolkit in there as well so that you have access to that. But I would say thank you so much for joining us today. And Dan, thank you so much for presenting all of this information. It's a lot to take in, but it definitely is going to help everyone be able to do it in a safe and orderly way to keep everyone safe.
Well, good luck, everybody. And, I think we're all thrilled to just be getting back back in the right direction. I would just encourage you to, take it slow and make sure you have a good logical plan in place, and I think you'll be fine.
Cool. Well, thank you so much.